Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's program. My name is Corey Walker. I'm the Wake Forest Professor of the Humanities at Wake Forest University, and I also serve on the advisory board of the Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markers Project. The Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markers Project is a nonprofit tax-exempt organization established in 2011 to honor the millions of captive Africans who perished during the transatlantic crossing known as the Middle Passage, as well as the millions who survived to build the Americas. This initiative involves 6 distinct aspects: commemorating the millions of Africans involved in the Middle Passage and the transatlantic human trade, researching and identifying all ports of entry for Africans during the 350 years of the transatlantic human trade, encouraging local communities to hold remembrance ceremonies at each of the 52 documented Middle Passage port sites in the United States, supporting the installation of historic markers to establish a permanent record honoring those who died and those who survived the Middle Passage, educating the community about the vital role that Africans and their descendants have played in the development of the Americas, and partnering with historical and cultural societies, academic institutions, churches, visitor and tourist bureaus, and community organizations to promote African diasporic history, culture, and thought. To learn more about the Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markers Project, we invite you to visit our website at www.middlepassageproject.org. Today's program is the third in a month-long series of programming highlighting the history, meaning, and contemporary implications of the Amistad Rebellion of 1839. And we're delighted to have with us this afternoon a dear friend and an amazing scholar committed to the critical practice of histories from below, Marcus Rediker. Marcus Rediker is Distinguished Professor of Atlantic History at the University of Pittsburgh. He has written, co-written, and edited 12 books, all of them histories from below. They are Between the Devil and the Deep Blue Sea, from 1987, Who Built America, with Herbert Gutman and other authors in 1989, Volume 1, The Many-Headed Hydra, with Peter Linebaugh, and Villains of All Nations in 2004. The Slave Ship, the award-winning text in 2007, Middle Passages also in 2007, The Amistad Rebellion in 2012, Mutiny and Maritime Radicalism in the Age of Revolution, Outlaws of the Atlantic, The Fearless, Benjamin Lay, A Global History of Runaways, and Prophets Against Slavery with David Lester and Paul Buell. His histories from below would include the award-winning The Slave Ship, which won numerous awards, including the George Washington Book Prize, and has been translated into 17 languages worldwide. He has produced the film Ghosts of Amistad, which we'll talk about in our conversation this afternoon, with director Tony Buba, and he has also written a play, The Return of Benjamin Lay, with the playwright Naomi Wallace. He has, over the years, also been active in a number of social justice and peace movements, including the worldwide campaign to abolish the death penalty. He is currently a guest curator at the JMW Turner Gallery at the Tate in Britain, and is writing a history about escaping slavery by sea in antebellum America. Welcome, Marcus. It's so good to see you, my good friend.
It's great to see you, Corey. Good to be with you. I'm looking forward to our conversation. And let me just say at the outset that I have the highest respect for the Middle Passages Ceremony and Port Markers Project. The Atlantic is truly a massive graveyard, and it's crucial that we remember that.
Thank you so much. This is truly it's an honor to be with that organization and the work that they've done over the past decade and continuing on into a new decade. It's important and critical work. Marcus, we're here to talk about the Amistad Rebellion of 1839. It's one of the key pivotal events in the Atlantic world. Can you give us an overview of the history of this Amistad Rebellion, and then we'll continue our conversation?
Yes, certainly, Corey. Let me share my screen to put up a few images. Okay, here's the title of my talk. The story of the Amistad begins in West Africa, specifically in what is now known as Sierra Leone, in which during the 1830s, there were quite serious, violent wars of enslavement going on. These are initiated by a Cuban slave trader named Pedro Blanco, who is resident in West Africa and operating a slave trading factory, which you can see here on the map, called Lomboko. Okay, the catchment area for the enslaved people who will be on board the Amistad is the interior of southern Sierra Leone. There will be about 9 or 10 different ethnic or national groups represented among those 53 people on the ship. They will make a voyage from southern Sierra Leone, from Lomboko, across the Atlantic. We can see that here's the Sierra Leone. They will cross the Atlantic to the north coast of Cuba on a Brazilian or a Portuguese slave ship called the Tesoura. They will then be taken off that vessel and resold to mostly to 2 men who will then put these 53 people on board this slave schooner called the Amistad. And the objective is to carry them to an area of Cuba on the north coast where the sugar plantation is really beginning to burgeon. So their fate was supposed to be working on sugar plantations and basically to spend their lives doing that. But on the voyage, the people on board that vessel, the Amistad, had a different idea about what their future would be. The rebellion really began when a member of the Amistad crew taunted a man named Cinque. His West African name was Sengbe, but in America he was called Cinque, taunted him by saying that he was going to be killed by these white people and eaten alive. And it was actually fairly widely believed in West Africa that these strange Europeans were cannibals. And in a very real sense, there was some truth to that, because the plantation system would literally eat people alive. So this man who taunted Cinque had really picked on the wrong person. It turns out there was a debate in the hold of the vessel that night, employing an African cultural form called the Poro Society, which back in the villages of southern Sierra Leone would make the decision about when to go to war. And it was decided among this very mixed cultural group that they would go to war to try to capture this vessel and sail it back to Sierra Leone. Well, they did so. They killed the man who taunted Cinque. They killed the captain of the vessel. They kept the 2 Spanish men who considered themselves to be their owners, who were now their prisoners. They kept them alive to help them guide the vessel back across the Atlantic to Sierra Leone. But the man who was a knowledgeable ship captain actually tricked the Amistad Africans by sailing to the eastward during the day very slowly, but then shifting sails and sailing to the west at night. Well, eventually what happens is the Amistad Africans engage in a remarkable sort of a voyage. They sail the ship from the north coast of Cuba all the way up the eastern coast of North America. It's about 1,600 miles. It's kind of a fascinating question as to how they were able to sail the ship, because most people who came from West Africa did not know how to sail a ship, but they managed to do it. They anchored around 30 times along the way, showing the skill that they had. They ended up on the northern end of Long Island, New York, here. And actually, we have an image of the uprising as engraved by a man named John Warner Barber, who went into the New Haven jail and got to know the Amistad Africans personally, so you can actually identify them. And the person here at the left, this is Cinque. They're attacking the captain. And here is the vessel itself once it's arrived on the northern end of Long Island. And in the background, you can see the U.S. brig Washington, a U.S. naval vessel, which is going to capture the Amistad and carry the rebels to New London, Connecticut, where they will be thrown in jail and charged with piracy and murder. Now, they are then moved to New Haven jail, which is the place where they will stay for most of their time in the United States. Once they reach New Haven, something really important begins to happen. Some local abolitionists find out that they are there, and they come to the jail, and an alliance is formed between these people who basically successfully captured their ship. They are the revolutionaries in this situation. And these mostly white, mostly middle-class abolitionists who come in to try to wage a legal campaign to win their freedom, in cooperation with the Amistad Africans, who are always explaining what they want, what they think. They actually play a major role in all this and how it unfolds. To make a long story short, a protracted legal struggle ensues. And in the end, to the astonishment of almost everyone, the U.S. Supreme Court rules in the favor of the Amistad Africans that they had been illegally enslaved in Cuba and that they were free to return to their native land in Sierra Leone. So what I've written about in the book is not only the legal process, but the history from below, the movement building that went on around this case. And I think what we have here is a powerful instance of self-emancipation. That's the way I think about the Amistad Rebellion. This is self-emancipation. These are people who fought for freedom, who won it, and then with the assistance of abolitionists, defended that freedom in court. And then, quite unusually in the history of the transatlantic slave trade, they went home. They were repatriated. There were originally 53. Only 35 of them survived. Several died during that 1,600-mile voyage to the north. But 35 people actually went home to Sierra Leone. It had always been their objective to go back to Africa. They never wavered. Some people wanted them to stay in the United States. They said, no, we're going home. They did go home. So this is really a very powerful example of the struggle from below against slavery, and all the more powerful, Corey, because it was successful. They won. And this was really rare in the history of the slave trade, that people could successfully wage a revolt and win their freedom.
Marcus, you really animate an exciting and really momentous tale in this story that encompasses so many nations, so many peoples, and including the Amistad Africans. You're talking about the Portuguese, the Spanish, and of course the British. You're talking about lands on Africa, on the continent, and throughout the Americas. And in your book, you write that the Amistad Africans were the heroes of their own story. Talk to us a bit about who these Amistad Africans were and what it meant for them to be involved and enveloped in this factory of the Atlantic.
You're right, Corey. It is absolutely an Atlantic story. And if you try to understand it only in the context of U.S. history, you're going to miss what's crucial. So just to speak for a minute about how I came to write this project, as you mentioned, the book before this that I wrote was called The Slave Ship: A Human History. And as I'm writing that book, I'm seeing that there are a great many rebellions on those slave ships, but very few of them are successful. So in the back of my mind, I'm wondering, how did the Amistad Africans pull it off? How did they actually win? Well, I went and read all of the historical literature on the Amistad Rebellion. And what I discovered is that historians weren't really interested in the uprising itself. They were interested in the legal battle. They were interested in the court case, which admittedly was very dramatic and very important. But without the successful uprising, you don't have a legal battle to wage, right? So I wanted to write a history of the Amistad Rebellion that put these African people back at the center of their story. And as it turns out, Corey, the key to their successful uprising lay in West Africa. Mm-hmm. I mentioned these wars over the slave trade. Well, one of the effects of all this in the 1830s was the very serious training of warriors to defend their villages against these marauding armies of a king named Shaka of the Vai people on the coast, who was in alliance with Pedro Blanco and the Cuban slave traders. This meant that every village did everything they could to protect themselves. And this in turn meant that of those 49 men and 4 children who were on the Amistad, they were all trained warriors. And this is crucial to understanding the outcome of the story. The image on the right here is of Cinque, as he was called, holding a cane knife. This was actually this was the weapon that was used. You saw it in the previous image too. These cane knives were basically the tool of liberation. It turns out that Mende warriors fought with cutlasses. So the long knife was something that he, in fact, knew how to use, and all of them did. So this is really crucial. So there's Cinque, but I also wanted to emphasize the role of others. Here we have John Quincy Adams. We'll come back to him in a moment. Here is a portrait painted of Cinque while he was in New Haven jail by an abolitionist artist. And notice that he paints him back in Africa, which is very important because he is there, he is free. That was his past, that would be his future. But it turns out the archive on the Amistad case is extremely rich, and we can know a lot about all of the different people who were involved in it. I've just chosen 2 here, a man named Grabeau on the left and a little girl named Margru on the right. I mention Grabeau for 2 reasons. First of all, he was widely acknowledged as a very high-ranking member of the Poro Society, which was this all-male secret society which governed the villages, made fundamental decisions, when to go to war, for example, that kind of thing. And Grabeau was a very high-ranking official in that regard, and a person of great spiritual power within the Amistad group, and immediately recognized as such. Cinque, on the other hand, was a military leader. He was a very, very distinguished warrior. So he was really the leading fighter, but Grabeau was just as important in many ways. And then I mentioned Margru because one of the things I discovered in doing the research for this book, that it was the 3 little girls on board the vessel, the Amistad, who were freer to move around than the men, who found a box with the cane knives or the machetes in them. So what the little girls did was find the tool of liberation. And they told these Mende, mostly Mende warriors, when they saw that they had these weapons, the very thing that they were used to using in Sierra Leone, they must have thought that this was a gift from the gods and that they were meant to be free. So these are the important people in all this. Now, the way the Amistad story has been told in the past, emphasizing the white abolitionists, the white judges, the Supreme Court, and especially John Quincy Adams, this had the effect of pushing the Amistad Africans into the background. You might say it whitewashed the story. So John Quincy Adams, I'm sure I don't have to say this to people involved in the Middle Passages Project, was not the hero of the Amistad story, although he played a significant role. And in truth, I have a lot of respect for what he did, because not only did he argue the case before the Supreme Court, he visited the Amistad Africans in jail and got to know them personally and listened to what they said about how he was supposed to defend them in court. So Adams is an important person. The other thing I would mention is that the jail itself was a school.
Mm.
A lot of learning took place in this jail, and the influence was reciprocal. The Amistad Africans influenced the white abolitionists every bit as much as the abolitionists influenced the Amistad Africans. Part of that was studying Christianity, for example. The Amistad Africans quickly saw that this was really important to these white abolitionist allies. So they said they were willing to do it. They were willing to study Christianity, but they maintained their identity as what they called the Mende people. Now, even though not all of them were Mende, but my argument is that they had heard people talk about the sovereign American people. So they came up with this idea of the Mende people. We are the powerful players in this story. So this is the background of some of the main actors, Corey.
Marcus, you highlight the historiography or the ways in which we tell the story of the Amistad. And in telling that story, we tend to really center the United States and the legal case around the Amistad. But your history from below forces us to confront the Amistad Africans, the Mende people, as they come to call themselves in the US, on their own terms. And the ways in which they understand the world. Can you talk to us a bit about how you're developing this history from below, if you will, and how it then confronts, let's say, something as big as the popular history of the Amistad, that 1997 film by Steven Spielberg of the same name?
Well, this is really why I wrote the book, Corey, because I wasn't happy with the previous history. I felt like we had a more truthful and, in fact, more powerful story to tell about this particular uprising. And you're absolutely right to say that the dominant force in popularizing this story was Steven Spielberg's film of 1997. In which John Quincy Adams is largely the hero, as played quite brilliantly by Anthony Hopkins. So in a weird sort of way, I wrote a book against a film to try to displace that narrative. I also objected to the way that Spielberg depicted the Amistad Africans, whom he treated as rather noble savages, kind of standing outside of history and culture. So what I wanted to do was to make them real. But it also turns out that most of the previous historiography, including a very good book by Howard Jones called Mutiny on the Amistad, had just focused almost entirely on the court case. And as I've said, without the mutiny, John Quincy Adams has no one to represent in court. So here was the dilemma I faced. Now, when I first started doing this project, I conferred with a lot of people, including African historians, and they all were a little bit discouraging. They said, you're not going to really find out much that's new about the Amistad story. That's been studied, that's been done. But it turns out, Corey, that there was a massive amount of material published, mostly in abolitionist newspapers, after the Supreme Court had given its decision. And as they were preparing to return to West Africa, a lot of material published about who these people were back in Sierra Leone. What kinds of work had they done? Which villages were they from? What their lives were like, long discussions with them, interviews with them. That knowledge was going to be crucial to getting them back home. So suddenly this became a very important thing. But the scholars who had studied the Amistad case basically stopped studying it once the Supreme Court made its decision. And it was after that where a lot of the African background became very, very important. Now, since Jones and since Spielberg, and even since my own book, there's been a lot of other important work, some of it done by African scholars. And I would like to give a special acknowledgement here to Arthur Abraham, the late Arthur Abraham, who was probably the premier scholar of the Mende people. And it was my honor to know Arthur, to talk with him about this history. He wrote a pamphlet, I think in around 1981, 82, on the Amistad case, connecting the Sierra Leone and the American history. So this was really a breakthrough. There's another work by a Sierra Leonean scholar named Ionulu Osagi, who talks about the role of the Amistad case, the images of it in both Sierra Leone and the United States. It's a very interesting literary study. And there is still a lot more work to be done on this. A colleague named Michael Zoiska has found a whole tranche of documents about the Amistad in Cuban archives. And he's published a useful book. Benjamin Lawrence has published a book about the 4 children called Amistad's Orphans. They played a very significant role. And then finally, there's another book forthcoming by a young scholar named Joseph Yanelli about what happened when the Amistad Africans went back to Sierra Leone around the organization of what was called the Mende Mission. And Joe's argument is that that was basically opening up the Underground Railroad in Sierra Leone. So I want to say that, you know, I did the best I could for my day, as Peter Wood put it, but there's a lot of new work and exciting new things to be done as we carry this history forward.
That is amazing, Marcus. The story continues to animate our scholarship, and we still are trying to figure out this deep historic episode. I want to remind our viewers who have joined us that we put 2 links in the chat. One is to Marcus Rediker's website, where you'll learn more about his scholarship and the Amistad. And then we're going to now we're going to turn a bit about a film, Ghosts of Amistad, because Marcus, you not only responded to that 1997 film with your book of 2012 on the Amistad, you also responded in film. And that response is almost precipitated by the ways in which a question is posed to you by Jerry Augusto, our dear friend, when we were all at Brown University. And Jerry asked you, now, Marcus, now that you have this story, when are you going to go to Sierra Leone and talk to the elders and look and then think through their knowledge? Talk to us a bit about how you shifted not only this writing of the history from below and from this text, but you also shifted it to the medium of film.
Yes, thank you, Corey, for that question. Jerry's question to me about the Mende Elders was very powerful. It stayed with me. And after the book was published, a dear friend and colleague, Conrad Tuchscher at St. John's University in New York, said, let's go to Sierra Leone and talk to people about the book there. Now, I got very excited about that. And then I also realized that we could make a film about this. So I went to another friend, quite a legendary filmmaker in the genre of working class film here in Pittsburgh, Tony Buba, and asked Tony if he would be willing to go and shoot a film, and he was excited to do so. But in planning the trip, our objectives changed. We didn't go to talk to them about my book. We went there to learn. We went there to basically do 2 things. One, remember I said that you could learn in these abolitionist newspapers which villages the Amistad Africans had come from? Well, I selected 10 villages. We had the help of an extraordinary man, the late Tazif Karoma, who was a lecturer in linguistics at Fora Bay College, who arranged for meetings in these 10 villages between our film team and local elders. So we went to these 10 villages, we talked to them about the history of the village, and we wanted to see what kind of memory survived in these places of the Amistad Rebellion. Because let's not forget, the Amistad Africans came home, and several of them came back to their villages. Well, as you might expect, in some villages there was no memory. In a couple of villages, there was some memory, but in 2 villages, there was a lot of memory. And so we did have a quite extraordinary set of exchanges, and we were able to learn more about the meaning of this event in Sierra Leone. In one village called Folu, we actually met a woman who was a direct descendant of the man Grabo, whose image I showed you a few moments ago. He returned to the village and was remembered by everyone in the village. So that was important. The second objective, Corey, for our trip was to try to find Lomboko, the slave trading factory. And this was a real challenge because people had been looking for it. Scholars had been looking for it for about 50 years, 40 or 50 years, and couldn't find it. And so when we went to these villages and so in Sierra Leone, we would ask the elders, and you know, among other things, and what about Lomboko? And they would say, oh, it's underwater now. That area was estuarial, so the water was constantly changing. Other people said it's gone completely to bush. You'll never find it. Nobody knows where it is. But thanks to Tazif, we found a man who himself didn't know where it was, but he took us to a fishing village where people did know where Lomboko was. So we actually got into the canoes of local fishermen, and they took us to Lomboko. So we did, in the end, find it. And this was a very gratifying part of the film, to be in that place. And Corey, here's one thing we learned from an elder from Toko. It had not appeared in any of the scholarship that there was actually a rebellion on the island of Lomboko, and that Cinque was quite involved in it. It's kind of a miracle that he wasn't executed, but there was an uprising there. There was another uprising on the Brazilian slave ship, and then a third uprising on the Amistad. So you can see how determined these people were to be free. But as you say, this film was basically, you might call it history from below in action, in which the archive is living people who have knowledge. And we did not, by the way, assume that they would want to share that knowledge with us. It turns out that Tazif Karoma was very well known and respected, so people did want to help us. But there's a complex politics of doing this kind of ethnographic research, and we tried to handle this in the most ethical way possible.
Marcus, for everyone, I really encourage you to watch the film. It's really history from below in action, and history from below is not only a critical historiographic practice for you, Marcus, it's also an ethic. I mean, in many ways, you see where that the narrative of the book recedes to the background, to the knowledge of the people that you encounter and the ways in which they are demonstrating and showing a deep knowledge. Some of the memory is not there, but then there's that deep memory that then emerges that becomes vitally important for you in finding these spaces. So I really encourage all of our guests this afternoon to spend some time with that film. And I also would like to invite the guests, all of you, to, if you have any questions that you'd like to pose, put them in the Q&A. We'll curate some of those, so we'll incorporate you into this conversation. But I want to ask you this one question, Marcus, and we talked a bit about this earlier. You really confront your place as a white historian going to Africa, writing this history of the Amistad. How were you received? Talk to us a bit about what it meant to actually move from the U.S. to Sierra Leone, and then how were you received, and then what were some of the issues that you confronted in wrestling with this history and also learning more from today's Sierra Leoneans, both scholars as well as lay scholars?
Well, one of the first things that we have to acknowledge, Corey, is that coming from an American university to a place like Sierra Leone, which is about the 8th or 9th poorest country in the world, still ravaged by the afterlife of the slave trade and also the British colonialism, which extracted so much mineral wealth. When you come into a situation like that, you have to be conscious of the fact that I was conscious of the fact that when we would go to one of these villages, someone might look at someone like me and be terrified.
Mm.
And historically, that would be completely justified. And I've said this to you before, Corey, but I asked Tazif, when we come into a village, who do people think we are? And he said, well, they think that if they saw just you, they would assume that you were an executive of a European diamond mining company and that you were there to exploit their mineral wealth. That's the kind of person that would show up in these villages. He said if they saw all of us, and our crew was made up of Americans and Sierra Leoneans, he would say they probably thought that we were an NGO of some kind. But then he added, but since they knew me, meaning Tazif, they knew we were going to be doing something much more interesting, and it probably had something to do with history. So my point in approaching all this was that you cannot stand outside this violent history of slavery and racism and colonialism, and you have to be honest, and you have to face it. But despite all that, and hopefully at least in part because of the respect that we showed, Corey, the people that we met were unbelievably helpful. In fact, some of our saddest moments came when we went to villages and there really was no surviving memory and people couldn't help us. And they felt terrible about that. But primarily, as I've said, because of Tazif, who was so well known and was considered extremely trustworthy, people opened up to us. They shared their stories with us. And the whole encounter was really very moving to me. It was just to see this history come back through the memories of elders was really powerful.
You talk a bit about, you really highlight the way in which the Amistad case and the Amistad Africans were part and parcel of American popular culture. I mean, there are thousands of newspaper accounts about the Amistad Africans. How was that, given that this is the Amistad Rebellion of 1839, it's 8 years after Nat Turner. I mean, we have we have 1829, we're thinking of David Walker's appeal. We're also thinking of the ghosts of Denmark, Vesey in South Carolina, and definitely Haiti going on, and the Haitian contagion still animated in America. How was this received in African-American and enslaved communities throughout the Americas? It's everywhere in the popular media, so it has to be somewhere in the enslaved communities in the Americas, enslaved and free communities in the Americas.
Yeah, Corey, that's a great question. And basically, it was, I think, a significant discovery in this book that the Amistad Rebels became major figures in American popular culture. And just to give one example, it was only a few days, literally a few days after they came ashore in Connecticut, there was already a play about them being performed in New York about their successful uprising with a surprisingly sympathetic treatment of the rebels. And this was really quite extraordinary because, one of the things that's been discovered about Northern society in the 19th century was its quite extreme racism. And that, of course, existed inside the abolitionist movement. But what I discovered was that when there were real people, and this is a crucial part of the story, these Amistad Africans were in the New Haven jail, and the jailer would actually charge admission to people who wanted to come in and talk to them. It was almost like a paid entertainment. And the jailer actually made a lot of money over this. Jails were kind of different in those days. But I think that the ability of people in New Haven anyway to meet the Amistad Africans had a very powerful effect, that they saw them not as abstractions, but as real people. And as people who were fighting for the ideals that the American Republic was supposed to be about. Some people said that Cinque is like George Washington. He's fighting for his people. So this place in popular culture is important, but you're right, it did have a special resonance in Black communities. One of the things that happened after the Supreme Court ruling was that the Amistad Africans and their abolitionist allies organized a speaking tour up and down the East Coast, held almost exclusively in Black churches. And people came out by the hundreds, the thousands. You couldn't get people into the buildings. And coincidentally, these events led to donations which resulted in the Amistad Africans essentially paying for their own repatriation. For a long time, people thought that the rich abolitionist Lewis Tappan paid for it. It was paid for by their speaking tour when people came out to hear Cinque and others speak about what they had done. So you could argue that the Black communities of the Northern American states are the ones who actually financed the return back to Africa. So this is another really important part of the story.
The jailer taking money sounds kind of like our private prisons right now.
It was a private prison situation.
That's right. We have a number of questions, and one very interesting question, Marcus. You mentioned the young girls on the Amistad who were part and parcel of the rebellion, their ability to move around and also to gain reconnaissance and help with the rebellion. Can you tell us more about who they were, and is there more information about those members of the rebellion on the Amistad?
Yes, I can. I learned everything I could about them. People might be surprised to know that as the slave trade continued through time, after abolition by Great Britain in 1807 and the US in 1808, as the illegal slave trade geared up, and the Amistad first crossing of the Amistad Rebels was part of that illegal slave trade, that children made up a higher and higher proportion of the enslaved who were on board those slave ships. Okay, so this is, you want to think about a slave ship, think about children. Dozens and dozens of children on board these ships. If you want to try to capture the horror, think about that. Now, these three little girls, we don't know as much about them as we know about some of the others, but we do know that first of all, that they played a major role in the success of the uprising. Secondly, we know quite a lot about Margru, who later changed her name to Sarah Kinson and became the first African-American woman to graduate from an American college, from Oberlin, if I'm not mistaken. She became a missionary, and she and her husband went back to Sierra Leone with I think 3 or 4 white missionaries to set up the Mende mission. The little boy among the group, whose name was Kale, was actually very, very gifted at languages, and he played an important role, even as a child, in helping the Amistad Elders to convey to John Quincy Adams exactly what they wanted him to say in court. So the role of the children is really crucial in all this. I should say the gender dynamics or composition of the Amistad were highly unusual, in that there were 49 men and 4 children. This was because the plantation region was in a kind of frontier state, and they wanted men to be able to clear the land in order to create the plantation infrastructure. So the Amistad was very different from other ships transporting enslaved people by having no women on board and only these 3 girls. But I do write about the girls at some length in the book.
You talk about, we've sort of tossed this concept around a bit in our conversation, Marcus, and it's central to your scholarly practice and your ethic, histories from below. And what you're reminding us of is that we're looking at an archipelago of insurrection. I mean, Vincent Brown's latest book, Tacky's Revolt, reminds us of that this Atlantic world is not a world that's just, slave ships moving with cargoes of humans across the seas. without any contestation, but instead these are, I mean, there's a battle that starts from the coast of Africa that moves on to the slave ship, that continues throughout the Americas until there's ultimately some semblance of freedom for Africans throughout. And in the US, it culminates in this Civil War. Talk to us a bit as a scholar focusing in on histories from below. What is that? What does that mean? And then how do we begin to practice it, not only in your scholarship, but also in public history?
Okay, important question. Let me begin this way, Corey. In writing the previous book, The Slave Ship, A Human History, that was a really gruesome task, because the horrors that took place on those slave ship were just almost unimaginable. But the one redeeming feature of that story was that people fought back in every imaginable way, from hunger strikes to committing suicide to rising up in insurrection again and again and again, even though if they captured the ship, they usually didn't know how to sail it. There are stories of people coming across a ghost ship in which everybody on board was dead in the aftermath of an uprising. So, but the resistance has got to be part of the story. The fight back is really crucial to all this. And you're right. I mean, Vince Brown basically talks about the war against slavery, which actually begins in Africa. Remember this revolt by Cinque and people at Lomboko. It continues on the Middle Passage. This is a place of constant struggle. And then that culture of opposition is carried ashore wherever people end up, whether it's Virginia, South Carolina, Jamaica, Brazil. There is already a culture of opposition that is in process. So this struggle the slave trade went on for almost 4 centuries. The struggle against slavery has been going on for exactly the same amount of time. And we really need to remember that. This is a key to teaching about this phase of history. And of course, I think, I would argue, Corey, I'd be curious to know what you think about this, that the scholarship produced on race and slavery in the US and around the world over the last 50 or 60 years is probably the greatest body of scholarship ever produced on any historical subject. What we know on this subject now is just extraordinary. But we now have the challenge of translating that into public programs and education. And that is really the challenge now, to take this quite extraordinary knowledge and to make it available to people, because we still have that great gap between the scholarship and the popular knowledge. We do admit that a lot of people don't want to learn this history. We're learning that right now. There is a lot of denial, but that can't limit the way we try to teach.
You ask, your response, Marcus, really hits on one of the questions that we have from one of our colleagues who are joining us this afternoon about ways to incorporate this history in our school systems. And of course, we see the backlash, the perennial backlash of histories from below, the ways in which these histories challenge it. And when you think of just your work on the slave ship and the Amistad and the work in the Atlantic world, folks like Jessica Marie Johnson most recently. Of course, you have the deep work of the late Julius Scott, and of course, folks like Gerald Horn and folks, just Jennifer Morgan's latest book. We're having this wealth of scholarship that's exploding the ways in which we understand not only the tragedies of slavery, but the ways in which Africans, much like those Amistad Africans, fought back. I want to ask you, you've done a lot of public history work around the Amistad and around a number of other historical works. So you've moved from not only books, you've also used film, theater, and you also use graphic novels in your scholarship. So you're trying to get it out there. Tell us a bit about what it means to tell this story to a broader public. What are the implications of the Amistad story in 2022 when we have CRT that's saying everybody, you know, that's saying that CRT is in your school and in your house next door. We have the vehement response against a very popular project to bring history to a broader public with the 1619 Project, and most definitely what's going on in our colleges and universities. Most recently, what we see out in Texas, where folks want to get rid of tenure and get rid of folks teaching this type of history. Talk to us a bit about your response to that, and then how you're dealing with that and how you're responding.
Yeah, well, let me say, first of all, that this CRT controversy is totally invented by people who don't know what critical race theory actually is, okay? Primarily, it's an assault on telling the truth about the actual history that the United States has. So let's begin right there. I think that's the crucial point about this moment. You know, what I've learned in writing about the Amistad case in particular and trying to take this story to as broad a public as I can reach is first of all, following up on something I said before, resistance matters. Mm-hmm. And successful resistance matters. And I think you couldn't have a better example of that than the Amistad case, because look at it, this small group of people, just 53 people, waged this uprising on a small vessel, a tiny vessel, a schooner, off the north coast of Cuba in 1839. And within 2 years, the most powerful people in the world are all debating what they did. The Queen of Spain, the Queen of England, the British Parliament, the US President, Supreme Court justices, members of the House of Representatives and the Senate, they're all debating what these 53 people have done. So this is just absolutely extraordinary. And this is one of the most powerful things about history from below. You never know when it's going to arise and really change things in dramatic ways. Surprises from history from below. And you and I both know Richmond. And we were talking before we came on the air, so to speak, that we never thought we would see those Confederate general statues come down in Richmond. But look at what happened in the aftermath of the murder or public execution, we might say, of George Floyd. We witnessed probably the single greatest surge of anti-racism the world has ever seen. Did anyone foresee that? I don't think anyone understood it. We knew, as Malcolm said, the conditions are there and they're combustible and they can explode at any time. We've known that for a long time. But this history from below arises in the most unpredictable ways. So we need not only to tell stories about the past that can enlarge people's ideas about the future, we also need to listen to young people who are going to be making that history, to see what stories they want to work with, what's meaningful to them about the past, because this is really crucial. One of the most important things that anyone can do in practicing history from below is to listen. To listen to the elders in Sierra Leone, to listen to the people in the streets, and to see what we can learn and how we collectively can imagine a better future.
Well, Marcus, I can't think of a better way to put just a pin to pause our conversation at this moment. Better than that, to encourage us to just listen. I know we have many more questions that folks have answered, and I know we could go on with this conversation hours on end, because the history is so rich. You're such a powerful historian and just a great scholar. More importantly, just a very morally grounded and ethically centered human being that I really admire. I want to thank you for joining us today, and thank thank you for sharing the story of the Amistad and your scholarship. And I want to encourage everyone to pick up a copy of this. It's a wonderful read. Marcus Rediker is a beautiful and elegant writer. We've given you his website, www.marcusrediker. So it's right there.com. Visit his website, view the free film. The film is made for free. It's a film that's been screened at a number of festivals around the world, Ghost of Amistad. And of course, I want to thank Marcus for joining us today. And what is our third program this month? That'll be followed by a program in next week on the 28th. And that program is how to teach the history of Amistad. So the question about bringing the history of the Amistad public, we're going to have a program that focuses in on that. We're going to have a number of folks with us. You can see them right there on the screen. But I also want you to recognize the important work done by the Middle Passage Project. The Middle Passage Project is really an important nonprofit entity that really is dedicated to not only making sure we understand and recognize this history, but more importantly, we continue to explain it to generations to come. So I want to invite you, as we close today's program, to consider supporting the mission of the Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markers Project with whatever level of donation that you're able to. We're able to accept donations through our online portal, through PayPal, or you can mail a check right to the Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markers Project. We have all of our financial information right available, readily available for you right on the website. We definitely love and appreciate your support. This is an important effort. It's been going on now for over a decade. And has brought in a tremendous amount of support from all over the United States, throughout the Americas, and of course, on the continent. So consider supporting the mission of the Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markers Project with your donation. Once again, I want to thank Marcus. I want to thank Nick, who's our technician, who helped bring us all together and make sure everything worked right. But most importantly, I want to thank you. You really brought this conversation alive. Your questions, we'll make sure we get to share those, and continue to join us next time as we learn how to teach this history to another generation, and how we teach this history to our children, even in this environment. My name is Corey Walker, and I want to thank you for joining us, and have a good evening, everyone.